Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to call up the other members of the panel, Honorary Neri Achar, to represent the Governor of Kisumu County. Sam, if you wouldn't mind doubling your role as moderator with a participant, given your local experience. Thanks. And we were hoping that we would have some local or regional authority representatives from Europe and South Africa to diversify the context, but for various logistical reasons that was impossible. So I'm going to ask Beth Perry, director of our Sheffield Manchester platform, and who works very closely with governance institutions and representatives in the north of England, to contribute a European perspective and to some extent a UK perspective, where many of the issues of local and regional governance are being rehearsed. And please come and join us as well. Thanks. One of the messages coming out so powerfully from Caroline's address a moment ago, other than the lived realities and how we need to accommodate them in our thinking about the city, is through what mechanisms and what processes that sort of accommodation could actually take place. And what that boils down to in one word is governance. It is how the lived experiences and realities of ordinary people of all backgrounds and contexts can find expression and find a secure environment in the way that Khaleb's story illustrates so powerfully for those people, without those who control land and property and financial institutions feeling threatened, and on the other hand, without the Khalebs of this world being totally exploited. That, in a nutshell, is what governance in an urban context boils down to. And one of the other challenges of contemporary thinking in terms of how we interpret this and try to put it into practice in urban contexts is that, again, there can be no master plan, there can be no universal prescriptions in detail, just guidelines of good practice drawn from comparative analysis. And that really is the ethos of what we do in Mistra Urban Futures in this comparative work of trying to understand the different realities of the Kisumus, of the Cape Towns, of the Sheffield Manchesters, of the Malmös and Lunds, of the Gothenburgs and Stockholms of this world, and increasingly as we open up new partnerships in Shimla in India, in Buenos Aires in Latin America, as an attempt through our choice of cities to understand the diverse realities, the contradictions, the opportunities, the constraints in these different places, and not to say everywhere should do as we do here, whichever place might be defined as here for that purpose, but to try to draw out some of the underlying principles, some of the lessons in broad terms, to push the boundaries, to test how far we can generalize without descending to the level of bland generalities which have no meaning in any particular context. And that is the challenge that we try to work through in all the comparative projects within Mistra Urban Futures. So the task of this panel, which is unprepared, it's informal, and is intended also to open up a dialogue with the audience, hopefully in terms of a discussion, a threaded discussion, rather than just direct questions and answers, is to hear from our panelists very briefly how, in their experience, in their respective county, city, urban, regional context, these sorts of challenges are being addressed, and to what extent that is being done successfully. So if I could simply start on my right, your left, with Honourable Kerry Achar, and then we'll pass the baton all the way through and finish with Christabel Johnson to my immediate right.
Thank you very much. This is my first time attending such a conference, but I'll try my best from what I've just heard. First, may want to just share, because I'll be taking up the docket concerned with most of these challenges. And my experience is that we find that okay, let me just start. When I was just driving from the airport this morning, I noticed one thing about the informal settlement on the roadsides. And I was shocked to see a cattle boma. You know, you get what I'm saying? Cattle boma? The cows, eh? So I used to hear of rural-urban migration, and this was about human beings. But what I saw this morning is we have started seeing the rural actually migrating to urban. By the rural, the population is moving into the urban with what they do in the rural, including animals. Now, another challenge, I may bring the challenges first of my experiences, and if I'm off also, you'll guide me, is you find when you look at the informal settlements, the people living there come from the rural. And when you go to their rural, they are very organized. Even if they have grass-thatched houses, they are very organized, they are very clean. But when they come to the cities and urban areas, they look so disorganized, filthy. What happens? So I think the research should go into the sociology part of what makes people behave differently when they move from their rural to the informal settlement in the cities. Is it their responsibility? Is it the responsibility of the city and urban managers? So, and I think we have come to accept that that is normal. I think even if the urban settlements, the way they are, we can do simple thing by just organizing them. They can be organized, whereby we provide access, which can easily be done, and then also sanitation. Again, when we talk of justice, just city and just urban areas, we are talking of giving justice to others. I think differently. I think justice should be a responsibility of everybody, including those we consider poor or staying in informal settlement. They also need to be just. And to me, justice means the right relationship with yourself, the right relationship with your environment, and the right relationship with your neighbor. And this is a responsibility of everybody. So we should not start thinking that somebody should be giving justice to the other. We need to be just. And we need just to, the cities and urbans, they have bylaws. But my experience in this country, I was born and grew up in this city, Kisumu, and it used to be a very nice city or town because the bylaws are there and everybody followed and respected the bylaws. What is happening now, I think we don't need to crack our heads so much. Simply, we are not following bylaws at all. So we are doing illegal things, and then when we try to rectify, or when the authorities try to rectify, then us, ourselves, including those who are sitting in this panel, we become the problem, because democracy comes in, human rights come in, because I can just come and just squat on a road, then when somebody comes to remove me, I start asking, where do you want me to go? Or how do you want me to make my living? And then you find other bodies coming in to support me. So I think these are areas I think also we need to think deeper as a panel here or in this conference on the basic things we need to sort out some of these issues. And then the interpretation of bylaws. now when I was hearing the speaker talking about LEFAB, it's very tricky when you are talking about the new urban agenda, because you find the interpretation. We tend nowadays to interpret these things like the Bible, whereby any interpretation is right. And I think when it comes to cities and urban, we need to be very clear on the law and interpret it the way it should be and should be enforced. I think I'll end there and hear the others so that if I'm off, I can copy how they're moving on. But I hope I was okay. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. I'll look at it that the great divide, or what's creating all this, is what I could say is the competing interest in our cities. And probably if I narrow down to the global south, Kisumu, Nairobi, Mwanza, and all these places, the issue is first and foremost, there's that influx, as Nari said, of people assuming that you're going to live better in the cities because you see there's glamour, there's light, because probably we are not that, we've not extended to the last mile electricity connection. So people tend to have the illusion that if you come into the city, you're going to have a better life. So everyone else comes into the city hoping that things will be better. But as we move into these cities, our governments are not prepared for that influx because they are not providing adequate water connectivity to these people. The jobs are not available. So you leave a place, a grass thatched house that was much better in the countryside, but when you come in, you realize that the place you can be is Kibera, Nyalenda, Obunga, and you begin to get into that life that is there. You wake up at 5 in the morning, walk into the city, looking for casual work, and occasionally, because there's limited work, if there's places for 20 and you're 100, they have 20 yes and 80 no. You select, and it's a ping pong. And if you pick a yes, you have job for the day. If it's a no, you go back, and then that's how it works. So that's how it starts. The majority, 70% of people living in these cities are basically live in this informal settlement. So that's real life. And some of them are able to uplift themselves eventually, some maybe not. But I think the main thing is once they're in, some are educated, the opportunities are not there, they feel excluded. So I think the greatest thing is inclusivity. As much as you cannot provide for all, how can we, in our planning, make everyone feel part of the process that is being operated from the executive? In our planning, is it truly participatory? Do we include them so that we have ideas and in design on the things we want to do? Are we just? Is there equity? Are the 20% that is more affluent influencing everything else that the 70% consume? So I think the leadership must be very alive to the fact who are the majority, what are the resources available, as much as you cannot evenly distribute it, but still at some point feel included in either decision making or the future plan, so that as much as it is not realized, but people feel wanted, people feel part of the process. Hence, you find that sports can be very effective. If you cannot enjoy anything else, a city like this should have a wonderful stadium because people love sport. So probably that is the only thing that can connect them to anyone else and the system. We must get things that connect our people from that 70 to 30% to the executive, so that we have a forum, and thereafter there'll be, it might not be that equitable, but people will feel they're part of a process. In their minds, if people are part of process. And I think we saw it in Kisumu during our time. Stephen Agong was chair of Kisumu Action Team. It was a forum whereby the city met. We called a meeting of the city. We had academia, we have the street trader, we have the big businesses, but they aired their views on the Kisumu they wanted. Thereafter, we crafted an agenda which eventually attracted an investment of 40 million euros. So it was a process. But all these things were participatory. So they knew that if, say, you're going to invest in a market, they took part in saying they wanted a fish market in Dunga. If there's a lot of people in the open Juakali, traders, artisans, you did something for them, but they took part in the process. Once people take part in processes, there will be ownership, and the feel-good culture is very important for sustainability in a city like this. But if they don't, like we had programs that had been brought to the people by World Bank and government, you will see some markets within this city that people trade outside are not inside because they were not included. They don't feel part of it. They said, you brought it in, but we don't like it. But if you participate or you involve people in early planning, they talk about it, they are proud of it, you find that it's a lot easier to function and actually actualize your aspirations, even as leaders of the city, because they can make it awfully difficult if they don't like the agenda or the idea. So maybe the connecting point is shared agenda, inclusivity in thought, so that we start the journey together that will make everything else subsequently productive and successful. Thank you.
So David's given us the task of talking about mechanisms and processes for governance and how these are being addressed. And from Caroline, we had, I think, one of the most important questions, which is, well, who is the city and who is the city for? So I'm going to draw mainly on some of the work we've been doing in Greater Manchester and just share with you a couple of thoughts about three we's, who is the city. And the first we is really a story of public and private stakeholders working strongly together since the 1970s in Greater Manchester in a context where there was no official recognition of what a metropolitan or city regional authority might look like. So right up until 2010, the task for city regional officials and authorities with their public sector and private sector partners was really to try and wrest power from central government in order to be able to have the resources, the possibilities, the mechanisms, in order to try and think about some of these complex issues. And the fix for that was initially seen to be devolution. Devolution agreements which were signed bilaterally with many city regional officials and partnerships across England, and the imposition of a mayor directly elected by the people of Greater Manchester. I use the word imposed deliberately because many of the citizens had actually said they didn't want a mayor, and this was seen as being imposed by the Treasury in order to be able to both control but also liberate, apparently, some of the city regions. And behind this project was really an economic agenda about inclusive growth. It was an agenda around efficiency, working across urban and rural boundaries, recognising travel to work areas, and it was a question around releasing the potential of economic growth in northern regions and other regions around the UK that had traditionally underperformed. It was not really about politics, and it was not about social justice. The first mayor of Greater Manchester was elected in 2016, last year. And in the very early documents where they were talking about this, the mantra was very much stronger partnerships, we can do more together. In other words, more of the same. So the Greater Manchester authorities went into this agreement with the mayor based on the fact that if they carried on working in the same way, with the same kinds of mechanisms and processes, they would somehow magically achieve different outcomes. But in the interlude, the sort of global political economy gave us some surprises and really unsettled people. It started off being about devolution, in the context of national regional relationships. But then, of course, we had Brexit, which nobody was expecting, which really revealed all kinds of disconnections across different areas in the city region, areas on the outskirts with high levels of deprivation that voted overwhelmingly to leave Europe. We also had the election of Trump and the rise of far-right nationalism, and this really has fundamentally changed the kinds of dynamics and concerns of politicians within the city region. So following the election of the mayor, there's been a much greater focus on working closely with civil society. So we see stronger relationships with the Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisations, for instance, which is in the process of signing a memorandum of understanding with the combined authority to make sure that civil society organisations are represented in this. They've set up a Greater Manchester Youth Council, recognising that young people also need to have their voice. They're beginning to deal with questions of gender. The original photo that was used to promote the signing of the devolution agreement, you won't be surprised, had about 6 men in suits, all white, standing up there signing this accord. And to their credit, the city regional authorities have worked quite hard with new posts and responsibilities and portfolios to try and address this. But other issues of marginalisation and voice remain unaddressed, such as race or sexuality. But what hasn't really happened in all of this yet is how we move to the third we, which is the we in which people identify with and want to engage in this city regional project. There is a real identity question, going back to what Caroline was saying, because the public or sector authorities and private sector officials in their partnerships feel a real sense of identity about Greater Manchester. This is a term that's increasingly relevant. Decisions are being made, money's being spent, but it just doesn't resonate with those individuals that live in different parts of the city region. So this does raise real questions over citizens' subjectivities, their senses of belonging, and the ways in which we can actually engage with them. So I think where we are now is a new phase of experimentation, a lot of uncertainty about how these issues can actually be addressed, some openness mixed with a lot of fear around what kinds of risks are involved by opening up the doors to citizen engagement. But with that comes a huge opportunity for a programme like us, which is where we're trying to think about some of the cracks. And the last thing I'll just say is this question of identity, I think, really is important. In Sheffield, which is the other city region in which we're working, they were also looking to sign a devolution agreement with the Yorkshire authorities. But some of the local authorities pulled out of that agreement because they simply did not feel that they belonged to Sheffield City Region, that they wanted a Sheffield City Region that would dictate and undermine some of the powers of local councils. They wanted their autonomy at the local authority level. I understand some of those issues are quite similar in Kisumu in terms of the relationship with the city and the county government. So there's some really ripe opportunities for comparative learning there.
Great.
The population within cities, are growing at a phenomenal rate, in South Africa as well. We have an influx of people moving from rural areas into the cities for economic opportunities, and this impacts on the form and shape of our towns and cities, and we're also struggling with that. Just in response to the Sustainable Development Goals, South Africa has developed a national development plan. And the plan was developed specifically to eliminate poverty and reducing inequalities by 2030. And in response to this national development plan, an integrated urban development framework was developed. And the framework aims to create safe, livable, resource-efficient cities and towns that are socially inclusive, economically viable, and globally competitive. And also where the residents can actively participate in urban life. In South Africa, we have a population about 56 million, and we have 3 spheres of government. We have the national government and the provincial government or regional governments. We have about 9 regional provincial governments, and we have 294 local municipalities. And municipalities are normally the people that's closer to the people and normally responsible for implementation and provision of basic services. I'm going to talk a little bit about the provincial government. That's where I'm from. I'm from the Western Cape provincial government, and we are specifically dealing with human settlements. And recently, our department or our provincial government have developed a Living Cape framework. But before I get to that, the entire Western Cape government has also put mechanisms in place to deal with city life and also align with the national priorities. The Living Cape framework deals specifically in terms of how we're going to move from rather the provision of housing to developing integrated human settlements. In South Africa, we have a very complex regulatory system or framework, and it makes it extremely difficult in terms of how funding gets allocated for human settlements particularly. And often the plans, development plans are not aligned, and it has an impact in terms of the rate of delivery. South Africa is also the only country, I think, that has a policy of the provision of free housing. And there's a great acknowledgement that this is no longer sustainable. We cannot provide housing because we have a backlog in the Western Cape, the city of Cape Town, of over 300,000, and we have 280 informal settlements just within the Western Cape area. So the focus has been to look particularly at spatial logic in terms of how and where we invest. We've also looked at to deliver in a much more sustainable way. So we invest that we have the maximum urban dividend because we can't keep up with the demand. So it's where we invest our resources that it's much more sustainable. But we acknowledge that the role of the state is very critical in order to realize this. So in response to the Living Cape framework that we've developed, the idea is to, by 2040, human settlements in the Western Cape will be support social, economic, and empowerment of people and communities. And communities, the private sector, NGOs, and the state will work collectively to realize this vision. We also try to deal with informal settlements in a very creative way. We've acknowledged that the role, often when we do research within communities, participatory planning, that the role of intermediaries is very effective. Intermediaries are people with vested interests that normally do research or participatory planning, and engaging within informal settlements, we find, they work much better with identifying social needs, and they're also very instrumental in providing strategic government guidance to government on strategic matters. So recently, we've also done quite a lot of work in informal settlements, and the focus is to really look at providing access to basic services where people can have a dignified life and access to be part of a urban life, to live comfortably and also be part of towns and cities and live life to their full potential. I think I'm going to leave it for now. Okay. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We'll use this as a roving microphone. So we invite contributions from the floor, and as I said at the beginning, it would be great if you can give us observations and open a discussion rather than just necessarily specific questions, although we welcome those as well. So I wonder if one of our colleagues could run the microphone around the room. And if you could just identify yourself before you start speaking,
Sure.
that would be great.
Hello, my name's Alex Paling, and I'm a new PhD student that's come along from Sheffield University. And I guess my question, and excuse me if I can't remember everyone's name, I'm not that great at it. But my first question is to Mr. Carr, and in regards to law and bylaws and those being important, but then in the previous speaker addressed that those same laws can perhaps close down opportunities for people to realize their livelihoods, and then how maybe there could be opening of spaces within governance. Perhaps the rest of the panel could discuss that, to not criminalize people that are trying to do their best within the situations that they are in.
We'll collect 2 or 3 and then respond collectively. Any other contributions? One at the back and then in front again, yeah.
My name is Patrick Ayombe. Okay, I just wanted to ask, in Kisumu, we know we have ethnicity and identity as key factors that affect delivery of social justice, deliver services and basic services. And this also is realized when you talk about ethnic politics and what we realize at the end of who is elected. I just want a response because we have the mayor and also the minister. Does that affect delivery of who owns land, who owns a market space, or who gets some water in your land or Manyata? Thank you.
Thanks. The lady in yellow here, and then Tapio Salonen from Malmö University.
Thank you. My name is Margaret Jobita. I'm a retired city manager of Kisumu and a few other local authorities, and currently a social development consultant. And I'm here courtesy of CLIP, Kisumu. Thank you, Catherine, for your presentation. In urban governance, I think our problem mainly is about the urban space. It is growing smaller because of the demands of the population and the needs of that space. And for the planners present, I being one of them, but a social planner, forgive me for saying what I'm going to say. Most of our interventions in these parts of the world have been reactive. And people, wherever they are very creative. They see space, they'll make use of it. And then we come back and say, oh, we have a slum. Where were we when these slums were coming up? Because they don't grow overnight. They grow progressively as we watch. Then we come back and say, we don't have these amenities, we don't have that. I'll go back to the first comment. Achar? Yes, I'm yet to get the names correct of all the CECs. Yes, Kisumu has a problem of land. And it is the city that has gone into the rural areas in Kisumu. Because the town as a city is occupied a very small space. But with its expansion, we have gone into the rural areas and tried to bring these people in geographically as part of the city. But their livelihoods have to remain the same. Finally, Mr. Chad talked about, the informal settlement being what they are, people throw solid waste and whatever anywhere. That is true. If I know that I'm going to be evicted any minute, what do I care about that space? Mine is to use it for today, make as much as I can out of that space, and wait to be kicked out. But where you have the owners, like, we have landowners as well, those whom the city incorporated, their compounds are fairly clean. But where you have someone who has no ownership to that space, that's where we have the problem. So if we planners could up our game and think ahead, know which direction we are going in terms of human settlements and so on, I think maybe some of these problems could have been avoided. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then the final one in this round, Tapio Salonen.
Thank you. Tapio Salonen, I'm professor in social work and also pro-vice chancellor at Malmö University. And my question goes actually well in line with the two latest. And this panel is about governance. And in line with Caroline's mind-provoking speech, I think we have to think in scales, but we also have to think in the crucial bridging between the representative democracy and the lower scale of democracy, where people have influential of their own lives in everyday life businesses. So my question actually is about, yes, we're talking about governance, but governance has to be system-changing governance. We have to think of democratic levels beneath the democratic levels that we have been used to. So I hope this is a mind-provoking question or a reflection for the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll hand the mic back to the panel and leave it to them in which order, or indeed which questions to respond to.
Yes, thank you very much. First, I'll answer the student from Sheffield University. The enforcement of city bylaws, that is one thing which we are going to do as a government, because there are some simple things like okay, thank you. Enforcement of bylaws, we are not going to criminalize anybody. Let's say those who are squatting on the roadside or the road reserves, we have to identify where we are going to relocate them to before we relocate them. And also we are going to educate them, explain to them why they should not stay where they're staying, and involve them. Like the last speaker, or the second last speaker, talked about a sense of belonging. So we have to create sense of belonging to them before we enforce these bylaws. So it is going to be very inclusive, involving the local leaders. And as I mentioned earlier in the professor's speech, we are going to devolve the government up to the village level through the village council. So it's going to be down-up approach as opposed to up-down approach. So it's going to be done in a very humane way. There's a speaker who talked about ethnicity. I think it goes beyond ethnicity. It comes up to clanism. You find one ethnic group breaks down into clanism, breakdowns to kinship and all that. That is a major challenge in terms of governance in this part of the county. But it's not a serious problem as such. It cannot hinder the development of the county and the cities and the urban. But we are aware about that. And when it comes to land ownership, let me just go a bit. The town has not gone into the rural. You find that the last speaker, or the second last speaker, if you go back to the history, you find that in 1967, the government made an effort to expand the municipality. So it started in 1967. And that was done in 1978. This goes up to Kanyakwar area, Kogony. You go to Kajulu, Kibos, Kasule, Koloa, and all that area. They were compensated, including Nyalenda, Panpieri, Manyata, Migosi. They were compensated in 1978 so that they move out so that the city or the municipality could extend to the current boundaries. The compensations were done, but the problem that occurred is that the city or the municipality did nothing with the vacant land. Then the grandchildren of these people moved back to the empty land which was not being used. And that has created a problem now. So it's appearing as if they are being evicted from their own ancestral land. So if you look at the Kenya Gazette notice 6862 of July 17, 2017, the National Land Commission has given a very clear report regarding what I'm talking about. And it has revoked or ordered those who are squatting in the government land to move, and those who had acquired the title deeds, the titles have reverted back to the government. So we are going to work with the people to implement that so that the city gets its land for expansion. We talked about the urban space. We are the current regimes more reactive than proactive. That is okay, that is correct. But I can assure you here that in the government of Professor Anyang' Nyong'o, we have a very elaborate plan on how we are going to deal with these issues proactively. You realize that Kisumu city has a lot of potential sitting on the lakefront, and it should be competing, I can say, with the Cape Town, Abuja, and Cairo. Those are the cities we should be competing with, because we are blessed the waterfront here, which can give us access to over 350 million people from East and Central Africa to trade with. The system changing governance from the last contributor is that you realize this is a political process. And if I just go back to the description, the rough description of what politics is, quoting David Easton, is the authoritative allocation of resources and values. So for us to allocate or to govern, we need political leadership to govern properly. And you need the political power to allocate these resources which are limited and values. And these values is justice, peace, all the things we are talking about comes in the values. Now, the land, the informal settlement, the town is getting smaller. The plan we have is to expand the town, because the boundary is big enough, as I've told you. It's only that people have encroached back. So what we need to do is just to construct low-cost housing outside town, but provide proper infrastructure so that the population staying in those areas, they don't fear staying in them, because they can access town within 5 to 10 minutes. So that we are going to do. Then also, we are going to decongest the human population in the city by creating jobs in the rural areas. With this devolution, you find we are going to do a lot of projects in the rural areas. So we are going to engage the rural population in doing these projects. Currently, what happens, you find that in a particular place or a particular rural area, if a road is being constructed there, you find somebody from somewhere is the one doing the construction. You find the casual workers come from somewhere else. What we are going to do, the government of Professor Peter Anyang' Nyong'o, is that we are going to form road maintenance, for example, like road maintenance board, which is going to be owned by the villages. And the people who are going to do this maintenance are the people who stay along these roads. And this is going to happen in agriculture and other sectors. So we are going to create jobs to the people right at their doorsteps. So in that, we are going to avoid or try to decongest town. So I hope I've tried to answer a few. So the ones I've not answered, I'll pass over to my colleagues to do so.
Thank you. I'll probably deal with what Dr. Yumbe asked. Mainly is elections, representation, and I think leadership. First and foremost, what we must understand is, yes, we have a diversified population and people in Kisumu. But one other thing, going back to elections, who actually goes to vote? I can say that the elites in this house today who are in Kisumu did not participate in the nomination process of the elections, because elections do come, but before that you have what is called party nominations. That can be pretty tough, isn't it? So, yes, we can question who did we elect, but the process starts way down at nomination level. We actually come to realize that we've elected the wrong people. Immediately we elect people because we have not participated. Dr. Yumbe, are you hearing me? Yes, we come into conferences and we talk about this. What we actually should do is to the realization, maybe through civil society, and whom do we want to elect? Is it somebody who dishes out the most amount of money and promises, empty promises, that they'll build roads that they can't build? Or who? Probably, let's look at the processes of elections, because at the end of the day, it's whoever gets in a fair process more votes is declared. I mean, I'm talking about the local levels here. And that being so, there's a process that in this country, there's law that says there's a nomination, party nominations, whereby you actually balance out on either gender and also people who might not necessarily get the vote, but do have very active part of developing that part of the world. In this case, I think in Governor Nyong'o's government, we've just, we know that in the nomination process at the local county assemblies, we have the Asian community represented, because if they go to the vote, they might not necessarily. I know Munira is saying probably might not agree with whoever was selected because the process, again, is a problem. But there's always a slot for representation of minorities because they might not get the overwhelming vote, but they actively participate in development. And I think even one of the cabinet ministers, the lady Mora, is from Kisii. But because of that community plays a very important role here. There's that gender, but also distribution. So I think it's not perfect. The law is there. The guideline is there, but it can be perfected, I think. The other thing is about planning. For planners, I think planning in any administration must be given prominence and stature, because what we find in most of these places is development is always ahead of planning. So the planners have a catch-up game, and then they hit a brick wall because influence and people who probably have built in the wrong places are a bit influential, and they have issues. So I think planning, working with all our stakeholders, Mistra, UN Habitat, all these cities must get their act together and they plan. Dealing with the peri-urban areas, that was a brilliant idea. The city moving into the countryside, yes, because we need land. But for Kisumu, you need to understand the land tenure of Kisumu. When you talk about informal settlements here, Nyalenda, Manyata, these are freehold areas. It's not like Kibera, where you can decide that you translocate these people from, because it was government land. These people who live in Manyata, Nyalenda, in Kisumu, are on freehold. That is, it's like ancestral land. So you incorporate them, so you must be a lot more smarter how you deal with them. And what issues, what can actually encourage them is more the commerce. If, say, they want to do something and the land is more valuable now, so they can get rid of this half an acre here and go and get 10 acres out of the city, things like that. But I think when we deal with planning, let's understand also issues of the background. All these cities are not really the same. You cannot deal with issues, I mean, policies of Kibera in Kisumu. It will be really be the opposite. And basically, democracy or participatory democracy, what has happened in the new constitution is you have the village council. It's slightly out of the ordinary planning. So what is going to happen that the current governor, he has planned, he's going to have a strong devolution ministry, and at the moment they're going around forming what is called village councils. So village councils will be quite powerful in that if there's any development in that specific area, they will be able to organize meetings with the civil society so that they sensitize at the lowest level. Is that what they want? Is that what they don't want? And if there's government or county government development in those areas and they are shoddy, they will be able to be strong enough to reject or raise their voices earlier on. So it's a nice counter system that is in place, wasn't utilized in the last 5 years. We think in the next 5 years that will be actualized. Thank you.
How do we deal with the invasion of open space? In the Western Cape, we also have a phenomenon where people invade land, sometimes suitable for living and sometimes not, state-owned land, privately owned land. But in the recent Living Cape framework, we've made recommendations where the provincial government will look at a portfolio approach to land. So when there's development plan, that it makes spatial logic sense in terms of where we relocate people, and also to look at how do we deal with privately owned land, the negotiations around that, but to better place people living in informal settlements to make sure that when there's a relocation that it's not far from opportunities or towns. What we've also prioritized at National Department, we have national upgrading of informal settlements plan, and there's been like mainstreaming of looking at what are the needs within communities, and that at provincial level, it's aligned to our budgets. We get an allocation from national specifically for human settlements. So what we've done, we've prioritized incremental upgrading. So it's an upgrading program for informal settlements, and we make sure that a large portion of our funding is allocated for addressing informal settlements. Then also delivering basic services. As the state, we have a responsibility to make sure that we act as an enabler to make sure that we see to the needs of people. So yes, we, from a government perspective, we do assist municipalities also to help them in terms of identifying. At municipal level, they have integrated development plans, and these plans have a 3-year span, and we make sure that when the plans are developed, that it includes development needs within integrated plans. At provincial level, we've had mechanisms that's been put into place. We call it game changers, looking specifically at sector planning. Technical committees have been established to make sure that when we do planning, that the planning are aligned so that we can look at better implementation, where the funding streams are aligned and the timing in terms of implementation, that it coincides to fast track and improve the rates of delivery. Then from a governance perspective, it is quite complex with the different spheres of government. We've recently, with the City of Cape Town specifically, there's a process that's called accreditation, and it's where the funding from national gets allocated to the City of Cape Town, and there's more flexibility in terms of how that fund can be used in terms of development. There's a big move from not just the provision of housing, but to develop integrated human settlements. So the funding would include other services also, in terms which is previously was not allowed, in terms of, because the human settlement or the housing code of South Africa was very rigid in terms of what you could do and how you could spend it. So there's a more flexibility from a government's perspective in terms of how we do this. What we're exploring, which is very exciting in terms of our Living Cape framework that we want to do, is learning, and we want to do innovative test beds. So we want to explore certain delivery models. We want to look at what is it that we can do differently as a state in terms of our role and still fulfill our mandate. So the innovative test beds would really allow for testing and doing things differently and exploring and see where we can replicate where it works. And one of the approaches is to look at area-based planning, because often we have development far from where it's needed, or people are isolated, but it's really to look at not just the surrounding or dealing with the informal settlement, but to look at development in its totality, a certain geographical area, that you take all elements into account.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just make a couple of general comments that hopefully relate to Alex, Margaret's and Tapio's questions. When we think about governance in Mistra Urban Futures, we have generally stuck with a pretty narrow traditional definition. We always default as our first entry point into thinking about formal public-private partnerships, public authorities, and at a push, voluntary sector organisations that are represented through coherent bodies that we can actually talk to. Caroline's already alluded to another understanding of governance through the lens of governmentality, which is about how citizens are constructed as subjects, either economic agents or through their ethnicity, in ways that empower or disempower them from actually getting involved in any of these processes we're talking about. So just very briefly, I think there are three other ways that we need to think about governance, and that we are certainly in Sheffield, Manchester. The first of those is to pick up the word that you used, intermediation. I think this is really important because we're talking about multiple actors across different scales. And we've identified 4 different kinds of intermediation that we actually need to realise just cities. So there's the question of how do you dig deep, this question of roots. How do you engage with organisations that are not necessarily hard to reach, but are certainly hard to hear and may not want to be reached in the first place. And that's often through local organisations that have that kind of reach. The second one's about relationships horizontally, building them and building coalitions across different organisations beyond local authorities that can actually support and galvanise two-way conversations between formal and informal decision makers. So that's a kind of relational intermediation. And then the third one is the more one we're familiar with, strategic intermediation, where you might have organisations like Betty's organisation that's representing different civil society organisations at a city level. And the last one is a concept Tim and I have been working on called active intermediation, which is really about our roles as researchers in bridging between these different governance spaces. What do we take with us when we go? What doors do we leave behind us when we leave? The second key concept, I think, is around deliberation, not just participation. We're all familiar with the language of wicked issues. We don't talk enough about how wicked the solutions are, because really there aren't solutions. It's still wicked no matter how far you go down the line. We really need to have more deliberative forums and spaces in cities in order to reconcile competing interests, recognising that not everyone will get their own way. So who wins? And how transparent is the process of trading off between very different kinds of interests? The third thing, I think, building on what Tapio said, was the relationship between the formal and the informal when it comes to political participation. Voter turnout is pretty poor in many areas of Greater Manchester. Our new mayor was elected with a mandate of less than 30%. In some of the poorest wards, there's less than 25% turnout for local councillors. People are opting out of the system because it doesn't work for them. But that doesn't mean they're not political. It doesn't mean they're not engaging. So in some of our work, we're focusing on informal political participation and routes to participation that are as valuable, if not more so, and how we can actually then think about ecology of governance, of decision-making processes beyond elections. I think behind all of this, we've got a number of tools in our toolkit, mechanisms and processes, representative democracy, multi-level governance, multi-sector partnerships, concordats, new mayors, different structures like youth councils that parallel what's already existing. But these are really the tools of the past. We can't assume, as I said before, that doing the same thing will achieve different outcomes. And so I think this is why we really do need to experiment with governance processes and mechanisms. We're facing a polycrisis. We're just not getting far enough in terms of meeting environmental objectives. When we miss our targets, we make new ones. With social justice, we've got huge exclusions across swathes of the population, no matter where we are. Spatially, whether it's in Greater Manchester, the urban and the core and the peripheries, there's huge issues there, just as there are here. So I really think that's my take-home message. The same partnerships won't produce different outcomes. So let's think differently.
Wonderful. And a very appropriate note on which to draw this panel to conclusion. So please give a round of applause to the panel. Christabel Johnson from Western Cape Department of Human Settlements, Beth Perry, Sheffield Manchester LIP, Sam Okello, former mayor, and Neri Achaya from the county government of Kisumu. We are running a little bit late, but it is now a break and a chance to look at some of the posters. Please be back, if you can, in about 15 minutes so that we can make up a little bit of the lost time. Thank you all very much.